Thank you so much for this invitation to present at this meeting. The subject I'm going to cover is cortisol measurements, choosing the most suitable method for my patient. But to be able to understand what the methods that might be most suitable are, we kind of have to understand the method. So we kind of have to understand how cortisol is being measured, what's the basic principle underlying that. And then we can talk about how we'll know whether those are good methods, and then we can have a little bit of time to talk about why we might want to choose one versus another. So almost all cortisol measurements and almost all endocrine measurements are done by some form of immunoassay. Immunoassay, the word itself implies that we are using antibodies, laboratory-based antibodies that have been developed to interact with the hormone of interest. And they may or may not be labeled with something that allows us to detect them in a experimental setting. There'll also be some hormone involved. There'll be what's described as a separation system. So once we've got antibodies in our reaction chamber, our lab antibodies reacting with our hormone of interest, we need to separate the antibodies or the hormone that haven't interacted. We need a detection system. We need to be able to figure out what has actually happened in that reaction chamber. Immunoassays were developed in the 1950s. And prior to that, it was very difficult to get hormones measured. So we've got to be very thankful that they do exist. They have become the main measurement tool for measuring hormones. The antibodies themselves could be polyclonal or monoclonal. So polyclonal would be the result of, for example, some hormone of interest being injected into an animal so that it develops antibodies that we can then extract from that animal serum to use in our laboratory methods. Monoclonal antibodies will react only with one specific epitope, and they come from a clone of lymphocytes through a development process that involves using laboratory mice. The polyclonal methods, they will generally create multiple antibodies that will react with slightly different parts of the molecule. And so there may be some improved sensitivity, improved ability to detect the hormone of interest, but they may also have some specificity issues. They may react with other stuff as well. So it's important when antibodies are being developed or are available in particular kits that they're going to work for our species. So predominantly I'm going to talk about dog in this presentation, and there would be some hormones where there'd be a physical difference between the human version of the hormone and the dog version. It's important that the antibodies don't react too much with other molecules that look similar, and in the case of cortisol, cortisol is a steroid hormone which has numerous relatives. There are quite a few different molecules that are based around that steroid central component that could cause some cross-reactivity issues, which we'll talk about. In an immunoassay, there's some kind of tag either on the antibodies or on some laboratory version of the hormone of interest that will create a signal. So that might be something radioactive, or it might be an enzyme that will cause a color change or a light development. And our detection systems could be detecting color change, the emission of light, or radiation. The separation method is designed to separate the antibodies that have interacted with hormone from those antibodies and hormones that have not interacted. This covers a little bit of what we've said already, and that is that whenever antibodies are being generated against a molecule, in this case a hormone, specifically cortisol, the animal that those are being generated in may generate a variety of antibodies that will react with cortisol, but might also react with other related hormone substances. One of the disadvantages to a polyclonal type of antibody, although it will react to more than one epitope and therefore perhaps more likely to find our hormone of interest, it often comes from a single source, serum source of animals, and so there's a limitation to how much of that can be harvested. And so commercial kits that depend on polyclonal antibodies will at some point have to refresh their antibody source or be discontinued. Whereas monoclonal antibodies can last forever, but they are directed only at a single epitope. These separation systems can be a variety of different approaches. I think most of the ones that you will come across in commercial immunoassays used to measure cortisol are where the antibodies are somehow bound to something. So they might be, for example, bound to the wall of a reaction tube. They might be bound to a magnetic bead in a reaction vessel. They might be bound to a membrane in a lateral flow type device such as this. But there are other ways in which those antibodies that are going to bind with stuff can be separated from those that haven't, and that might be involving precipitating them or having antibodies themselves that are magnetic that can be moved around. Or if we are interested in separating the bound from the unbound, we could absorb the free hormone with something non-specific such as charcoal. So there's these different types of method, but most of the commercial cortisol methodologies that we're talking about for immunoassays will be some kind of solid phase separation method. Although I've said that immunoassays will generally require a separation phase, which we call these heterogeneous assays, there are some technologies now which allow for faster processing, which don't require separation of the bound and the free parts of the reaction. So there's no wash or waste liquid generated as part of that separation step. We'll come back to some of these concepts as we work through some of the methodologies that are actually available. When it comes to detection systems, these are making it possible for us to recognize that an antibody has been able to find our hormone of interest. Those might cause a change in color in a reaction tube through a technology called ELISA, using enzymes like horseradish peroxidase or alkaline phosphatase. They may be chemiluminescent, that is, there's an antibody attached to an antibody or a hormone molecule attached to an enzyme, alkaline phosphatase, that can induce a light reaction, a generation of light that can be measured. So this chemiluminescence principle is what's used in an Immulite, and we'll talk about Immulite quite a few times through the rest of the presentation. It's a common referral lab methodology for measuring cortisol. Some methods will do something very similar but generate fluorescence rather than light. And then there are technologies that don't use light at all. They use labeled hormone that's been labeled with radiation. There are some issues with light detection potentially if there's a dark color in the sample or something that makes this enzyme reaction not work as well as it should. Then the system's not going to properly detect the bound hormone. Whereas radiation tends to not have any of those, doesn't have any of those issues. The radiation can still get through no matter what color the serum is, and it doesn't depend on an enzyme working. Some enzymes, for example, alkaline phosphatase, would need metallic cofactors, and if the sample, for example, has been taken in EDTA, which will have bound out those cofactors, then that reaction can't proceed, and so a false result would be generated. But that's not something that would affect a radiation-based detection system. So these are some classic immunoassay setups where we've either got some fixed antibodies around the side of the wall where our patient and hormone, identified here in green, competes for these binding sites with a radioactive labeled version of the hormone. That gives us a dose response curve a little like this. So the more of the cortisol we have in the reaction vessel, the lower the light emission or color change or radiation that's coming from these labeled hormones. This other format doesn't tend to be used for cortisol, but it might be used for other hormones where we've got antibody fixed to something solid. The hormone of interest interacts with those, and then another labeled antibody is used to detect that interaction. Both of these methodologies do require some wash steps to get rid of all of the stuff that hasn't bound to anything. There's a technology more commonly used in thyroid hormone analysis in veterinary commercial labs at the moment, which is a competitive enzyme thing. The term, the name that I'm going to use for this is DRI, dry. So that's one of the brand names used for when it's measuring total T4, but the same concept is being used in some labs for measuring cortisol. The advantage in this methodology is that it can be run in a general chemistry analyzer. It doesn't require a separate special immunoanalyzer, and it also doesn't require a wash step to get unbound material washed away. So this is one of those homologous assay systems. So when we have these detection systems detecting our interactions with antibodies and hormones, how do we turn that into a concentration? Well, generally we will have started with some samples with known cortisol concentration. We have run those in our system to find out what absorbance or change of absorbance, what signal is generated. And then we can draw a line through that from which we can then extrapolate our concentrations. So if we had a signal that was about here, we could extrapolate then that to a particular concentration. When we're using radioimmunoassay and that dry homologous assay technology, we often have numerous calibrator points, which means that even if like one of these didn't work quite that well, there was something wrong with it, then the general shape of the line is likely to be still predictable from the data. However, if we're dealing with some of the in-clinic technologies and also the Immulite technology, what that tends to do is that they have some kind of stored idea of what the reaction shape should look like. And then either with just one calibrator point or reference point, like in a lateral flow method, or as might be the case in a Immulite adjuster system, 2 points. Those allow then the system to realize which of these characteristic curves it should be using to do its data analysis. So these other methodologies have much less calibration points. So starting to put some names to some of what is actually available to measure cortisol, we've got radioimmunoassay, RIA, that's available in specialist laboratory facilities. Some other reference labs might be using chemiluminescence or what might be called enzyme immunoassay, but generally using some dedicated immunoassay analyzer, floor standing or benchtop analyzer. These are both Immulite machines. Or using this DRI technology, most commonly used for thyroxine, but as I say, I think somewhere in the world, some labs have been able to make this work for cortisol. And then there's an array of in-clinic analyzers that are using dry slides or lateral flow type technologies, or surface plasmon technology, which we'll just highlight briefly. So what are some of the advantages and disadvantages to these technologies? Well, radioimmunoassay is still generally reported and considered to be the gold standard methodology. I've already touched on the fact that one of its kind of advantages is it generally has a multi-point calibration, usually 4 or 5 points at the very least, and radioimmunoassays are generally recalibrated with every patient run. So every time a patient sample is run, there are calibrators run at the same time. It has a wide dynamic range, that is, generally it can measure from very low concentrations to very high concentration with the same assay setup. It tends to have less matrix interference, so there might be things that affect the nature of the sample. Maybe it's a bit lipemic, or there's something else in there that's changing something about the chemical makeup of the serum sample, and radioimmunoassay would be less affected by that. Also, the labs themselves have the opportunity to adjust things in that assay to improve it, to make it work better for them and for the species they're running the assay on. The downside is its manual sample handling usually, which brings with it some variability, what we'd call imprecision, because each time we press the pipette handle, we might do it slightly differently. More difficult for labs to operate a radioimmunoassay. They do need specialist facilities that are able to handle that. It's a very kind of safe and low level of radioactivity, but it still needs to comply with all local regulations. The chemiluminescent Immunolite type technology, that works off a stored calibration. There's only 2 adjuster points and a narrower dynamic range. That means in each assay there tends to be a limit below which it can't measure. So for cortisol, it might be less than 27 nanomoles per liter, and a number above which that it can't measure, which might be like 1,000 or something like that, which is probably enough for most of our canine uses, at least. It uses a stored calibration. So once the laboratory has run the calibration on this machine, the calibration stays in there for a few weeks. And samples, each time a sample is run, it's run from that old calibration. There's no fresh calibration each time. It's completely automated, and the operators don't have any choice about how that runs. The manufacturer's decided how that runs. This DRI homogeneous assay, if a cortisol one is available, there's a couple of labs that are using something. They may have created it themselves, but it does allow the same analyzer that routine chemistries are being run on, like urea and creatinine, to also measure the hormone of interest. It does run with a multi-point calibration like RIAs. And then there are a variety of methodologies that use this kind of color change ELISA principle, like lateral flow, reflectance photometers, and those kind of things, commonly used either in clinic technologies, although sometimes labs use ELISA plates. So just kind of a brief reminder, not in any great detail, but maybe just highlight that it's worth understanding how the method works that you're planning to use. So this kind of snapshot or lateral flow type device, there are bound antibodies to a membrane, and the patient's sample and some more antibodies are what's being passed across that membrane to get a change in color according to cortisol concentrations. I'm not actually convinced there is a reflectance photometry methodology for cortisol, but if there were, it would be by this principle where there would be multiple layers within one of these slides, and one of that layer would have some antibodies in there, the setups for thyroxine. So it would be the same sort of thing if there was such a thing available for cortisol. One of the other in-clinic devices that can measure cortisol uses this fluorescence technique, where again there's antibodies bound to a well, the hormone of interest interacts, and then some more antibody-bound fluorescent particles will bind to those. There's no need for a wash step because the excitement reaction is happening only to those molecules that are tightly attached to the bottom of the membrane. So those are some of the different concepts in cortisol measurement technology. Touched on this already, this little bit about the limited life in an immunoassay when we talked about polyclonal antibodies. Particularly when we have polyclonal antibodies, that supply of antibody will eventually run out, and it requires the manufacturer, if they want to keep selling that kit, to find a new source of antibodies. But those antibodies might not be quite the same, so every animal that's creating antibodies against cortisol are going to maybe create some slightly different ones. The manufacturer may go through some amount of effort to make sure that their new assay, their new antibody, still works for whatever species they're making it for, which realistically is generally humans. They maintain the assay name and the brand name, and then they release it to the market, and us veterinary laboratories end up taking that assay and not until after something goes wrong do we realize that maybe that new antibody doesn't work as well for our veterinary purposes as the old assay did. Sometimes assays just disappear from the market when we can no longer get, where we can no longer buy a method that still works for veterinary species. Cortisol is a steroid, and steroids are identical regardless of what species we're looking at. So dog cortisol and human cortisol and rabbit cortisol and cat cortisol, everybody's cortisol is the same. This is its molecular structure. So cortisol is cortisol is cortisol. There's only one cortisol. However, this steroid molecule shape does have a variety of other steroids will have this general shape with differences up around this part of the molecule and maybe down here and in here. When it comes to generating antibodies for laboratory use that's going to react with cortisol, clearly, since all animals that are generally used to make antibodies have their own cortisol, then just injecting cortisol into them isn't going to make them create an antibody to that hormone because they already have that hormone, so they're immunotolerant of it. So the way that cortisol is made immunogenic is by attaching it to something bigger that will incite some kind of reaction. And so that may mean attaching something at this end of the cortisol molecule, down near the sort of 1s and 2s and 3s numbers of the carbon numbering system, or maybe involving attaching something up at the other end of the molecule. So kind of depending what construct is made to induce those antibodies means we're going to get antibodies that react with different available elements of the molecule to interact with. So these different conjugation approaches are going to result in some very dramatically different antibody reactivities. Because there are steroids that have lots of different, lots of closely related steroids to these, it's possible then that one of these antibodies might be more likely to react with those close relatives than the other one is. So, for example, a manufacturer of a cortisol assay will generally go and source a lot of steroid-shaped hormones that are structurally similar but aren't cortisol, and then test them in their cortisol assay to see whether there's a cross-reaction, to see whether or not the presence of that hormone will interfere with the assay or whether the antibodies will pick that up. So for example, there's a package insert from a company that makes a cortisol assay on an analyzer, and they're saying that, yeah, their cortisol assay will be affected by the presence of prednisolone or fludrocortisone. Both of those will cause false high values, but also cortisone will a little bit, but they don't think other things that might be similar, like 17-hydroxyprogesterone, they think doesn't create much of a reaction. So it's important that any manufacturer understands what their assay picks up, and then they're really honest with us. It's also important as for clinicians to recognize sometimes which of these substances will react in a cortisol assay. So an animal that has received dexamethasone, like in a dexamethasone suppression test, there's going to be no problem there about using this assay to measure cortisol. Whereas an animal that's recently received prednisolone for some reason, then we're going to get some false results. So I've talked an awful lot about immunoassay because that is the main method being used worldwide for veterinary cortisol measurement. In some human laboratories and in one or two veterinary laboratories in Europe, there has been a move to using a measurement technology called liquid chromatography mass spectrometry, or tandem mass spectrometry. It's abbreviated to LC-MS-MS. And this methodology works by actually identifying the molecules that are present, the actual molecules in terms of the molecular structure and the fragments that they would break down into. It is highly specific for each molecule will make a very distinctive pattern, and so it is possible to detect individual molecule types. And so theoretically, this measurement technology will get around the cross-reactivity problems that we have with immunoassays. As I say, one of our biggest problems with immunoassays is the antibodies might not react only with cortisol, they might react with other similarly related substances. So in the future, it's likely that more LC-MS-MS technology will be brought to bear in veterinary laboratories, but at the moment, it's mainly immunoassay. So when we're sticking with immunoassay, how would we know that the method that's being used by a particular lab or a company that wants to sell a lab a particular method, how do we know that that method works? So theoretically, that should go through an analytical validation process. And that validation process would include some of these elements here. One of which, the first one, precision, that is the repeatability. If we put the same sample through the equipment multiple times, how close will the results be? Accuracy, how true are the results that we're getting? Specificity, are we getting some cross-reaction with similar related substances? And how low of a level of, or how low a concentration of the hormone of interest is this assay technically capable of measuring a limit of detection or limit of quantification? And then after all this work is done, ideally then we would go and check what our reference intervals would be with this new method, what our diagnostic threshold and cutoff values would be with this new method, and any interferences. So most labs will go through some interference study and they will look at some reference intervals, but some of those diagnostic clinical cutoff values, laboratories are not really in a position to reevaluate those. So just highlighting, in case it's not clear what the difference between precision and accuracy is, ideally we would have all our results. If we ran the sample multiple times, we would get very similar results, and hopefully all of those are landing where the correct result is. However, if our results are all landing close together but not where they're supposed to be, then yes, the method's precise, but it may be inaccurate. Or we might have a method that is imprecise, where each time we run the same sample through it, we get slightly different results or unacceptably different results. So how would we assess imprecision? Well, this particular example here is for total T4, but a laboratory would take a serum sample that it has received from a patient, or pool some of that surplus serum together, and they would run it through the analyzer multiple times, at least 10 times, maybe 20 times. and they would get a range of results. They could create the mean for that and the standard deviation and create a figure called the coefficient of variation, which is the standard deviation divided by the mean. If a laboratory or a manufacturer is not willing or not able to provide that information, then it is something that you can arrange to do yourself. If you're a veterinarian in practice and you really want to know and your lab won't tell you, then you just split a spare sample up into multiple aliquots and send them those aliquots without telling them they all come from the same animal and see what range of results you get. One of the things to bear in mind about coefficient of variation is it will vary according to the concentration. So there'll be kind of an ideal range of concentration that the assay, the cortisol assay, is capable of measuring and is designed to measure. And once we start getting to concentrations that are lower than its capability or higher than its capability, we'll start seeing higher coefficients of variation. We'll see less precision. A kind of generally acceptable level of precision for immunoassays is 10%. The coefficient of variation divided by mean as a ratio is 10%. This is a much higher figure than would be acceptable for something like creatinine or serum sodium or serum potassium. Those operate at precision levels in the 1% and 2%, or even lower. But for immunoassays, 10% precision is not a bad target to achieve. So let's look at one particular analyzer recent history that maybe exemplifies or gives us an example of some of the points that we've already made. So cortisol has been measured on Siemens Immunoassay machines in veterinary labs around the world for a very long time. And people have got very comfortable with those results and quite happy with them to a large extent. But in the autumn of 2020, they ran out of the antibody that they had used for a long time, a polyclonal antibody they used for a long time, and they had to find a new source of polyclonal antibody to continue to make a cortisol assay, which they did. They checked how the previous antibody worked against the new antibody and found that it worked really very equivalently in human samples. They did notice, however, when they did their cross-reactivity chart, that there had been a change in the cross-reactivity with cortisone and a change in the cross-reactivity with 11-deoxycortisol. So the new polyclonal antibodies did work a little bit differently from the old ones, but across a lot of human samples, it didn't seem to make much difference to the results, so that was released to the market. However, when veterinary labs started using this new Immunoassay assay, they started noticing that actually this new method seemed to be delivering lower results than the old method was. So the European Society of Veterinary Endocrinology, we got a bunch of laboratories that had the new assay to compare results that they'd got before and after the change in method. And on average, the new method was delivering results that were around 23% less than the old method. So that caused labs to then question, if the results are coming out 23% less, does that mean some of the cutoff values that we've used before, maybe an 8-hour low-dose dexamethasone suppression test cutoff of 14 animals per litre, should we be bringing that down, that cutoff value down by 20 or 25%? Should our ACTH stim test reference intervals be adjusted because of this new methodology? But then our reference intervals will be different from everybody else's, and everyone else's are using textbooks to decide what they should do with their cortisol results. And so it created a bit of a fuss. It became a problem. Interestingly, there was a very big difference. Some labs had been using this method to measure urine cortisol for urine cortisol creatinine ratios, and they discovered that when they shifted to the new method, the results fell by almost 70%. So a very big difference in the cortisol metabolites that were coming out in urine that this new antibody picked up compared to the old one. So a couple of months later, after the veterinary labs had made it clear that this assay was causing a shift and that might be causing a problem to them, the manufacturer kind of went back and they didn't change the antibody. It's still the same human antibody, the same antibody that they used in the human version of the kit. But what they did was they adjusted the calibrator values when used for veterinary purposes so that the results fell much more along the lines of what they would have done on the old equipment. And so on average, instead of a nearly 25% decrease, there's a less than 10% decrease on the new version of the assay. And it improved very slightly the impact on urine. So even with the new calibrator values, the urine difference was quite considerable from the old method to the new method. And then to try and make that more straightforward to laboratory users, they created what they called a veterinary cortisol assay, which is the same assay as the new human assay, but with different calibration figures in there to try and account for that shift in result. So that story kind of reminds us that the manufacturers of human equipment are focused on the human market, and we need to be careful and vigilant when things change so we can see whether they impact our veterinary results. Because that change means that a dog that had a low-dose dexamethasone suppression test before the assay changed might have been considered positive, but after the assay change would have been considered negative, and that's quite a different impact on the animal because of a manufacturer change. So let's have a further look then at some different methods that have been used or that are available, and just see what that impact is on the results that they generate. When I'm looking at whether an assay is likely to work well, one of the quick ways that I can do that, so in that ESVE example, a couple of slides back, let's go there. You know, these are hundreds of samples, and if you want to do this kind of study, we need at least 40, and we need those 40 to not all be bunched around a single concentration. We need a wide range of concentrations, and that can be quite hard to source, and it's also quite expensive to do that kind of analysis because we're having to repeat the analysis on a lot of samples in 2 different methodologies. So what I often do when I want to just quickly look at a new method without spending a huge amount of money and running lots of replicates and sourcing lots of comparative serum samples is really just find 2 serum samples or 2 pools of serum, one that doesn't have very much of the hormone that I'm interested in and one that's got a lot of it. So I kind of have a high pool or a high sample and a low pool. We mix those 50-50. So the sample in the middle that we create should have a value which is exactly halfway between these 2 starting concentrations. And we can mix those ones again to create some other midpoints. And so we can end up with 5 or 9 different equidistant concentrations, and we can plot them on a graph here so we can have our low and our high, and our one that's exactly halfway in between should have a result that is numerically halfway in between our concentrations. And we can obviously do that again. So if an assay is working well, then we should get our middle result landing in a straight line between our high and low, and all of these other samples should generate a result that lands perfectly on that line. It tells us about internal consistency of the assay. It tells us about something called linearity, and it also tells us a little bit about precision, because the variability in the results that are generated could be one reason why they're not landing perfectly on the line. So that's the point. That's an introduction to some of the graphics I'm going to show you next, which use that kind of approach to quickly look and see what's going on with assays. So this graphic on the left looks quite busy, but it's where we've taken a sample with a high cortisol value and one with a low cortisol value and mixed them 50-50 to get some results in the middle, and done that again to get 9 data points. And each of these different colored lines represents a different cortisol methodology. So we've got the Immunoassay 2000 in here in blue. We have got some radioimmunoassays, a variety of different manufacturers' radioimmunoassays. And we have got a benchtop analyzer called a Tosho. And so there's a few things we can see from this. We can see that generally most of these have results that are sort of lying on a line, not as nicely as we might like, but generally sort of lying on a line. We have got a range of results being generated. So the same sample, the same high pool, is generating results anywhere between 330 and 816, depending which method is being used, although most of the methods are somewhere between 330 and 430. Some of these values that are down around where we might interpret a low-dose dexamethasone suppression test, we've got some that are as low as 27, up to as high as 85. So using the kind of published cutoff values or journal article cutoff values, it's going to be very problematic if we don't know how our assay fits with the assays used to derive those cutoff values in the first place, because there's a big range in results depending on what assay is used. The other thing that this highlights is that several of these methodologies are radioimmunoassay. So there's nothing fundamental about being a radioimmunoassay that means that you always generate the best or the same results. So this particularly unusual assay is a radioimmunoassay. It's generating very much different results, almost twice the values generated by all the other techniques. But there's radioimmunoassay results mixed in here with the Immunoassay and Tosho analyzers. What this is over on the right-hand side is where we did do the same thing with a benchtop in-clinic analyzer, a snapshot lateral flow device. The protocol for that required either using 25 microliter samples if we imagined the sample likely to have a high concentration of cortisol, or a larger sample volume if it seemed like it might be a lower value. And what we could see is that with the 100 microliter sample, it sort of fits on a line until we get up to around 150 or so, and then beyond that, it doesn't really fit the line very well. The 25 microliter samples kind of fit their own line, but it doesn't bear any relationship to this. So there's no kind of single line that we can draw through all of these data points. So that methodology doesn't seem to be internally consistent. So twice the amount of cortisol doesn't generally generate twice the amount of result in that assay approach. So that was using this kind of sample mixing approach to just look at a lot of assays at once to just see how they compared, verified that there's quite a bit of a range. Some assays are more internally consistent than others. Some radioimmunoassays give higher results than others. This is some data from a recent study that we did, and this gives us the opportunity to compare that new Immulite cortisol method, that one that's only been available since late 2020, with LC-MS/MS. That's that technology which doesn't have the problems of antibody cross-reactivity and is starting to maybe become the new gold standard. And compared to LC-MS/MS at University of Manchester's hospital method for LC-MS/MS, the new Immulite is generating some results that are substantially higher, or quite a bit higher than what the supposed true level is based on LC-MS/MS. Okay, so that was some data comparing different methods. What about the same method in different labs? Well, the European Society of Veterinary Endocrinology runs a scheme where twice a year it sends samples around the world to a lot of different labs, who then send the results back, and we see how much the results vary. And we generate reports that look something like this. This is a relatively old one in terms of the number of participants. But what we can see for cortisol, so we've got results ranging from something as low as 48 to 241. All the labs have received the same sample. What we can also see is that some of the most common ways of getting it measured, which would include those Immulite technologies, are generating coefficients of variation between labs of 17 to 18%. So even the same method run in different labs is creating a range of results. And we can see that although if we average all of the results, we get a cortisol value of around 140, some methods are much lower than that, and some of those are a good bit higher. Apologies. So looking at a more recent release, this is last year's ESBE release, a larger group of participating labs. But we had to divide up the Immulite users according to whether they already had started using the new Immulite reagents, and if they had, whether they were making any adjustments to the results. And so we can see, again, although we had an average value for cortisol across all the analyzers of 118, we can see that some of the newer users of the new method are generating lower results on average, here about 100, compared to 100 or 117 compared to those that were using the previous method around 140 or so. We've also got quite a range of results. Some analyzers are generating much lower values. The only one lab that uses LC-MS/MS in Europe generates a very much lower value for this sample, and it's okay that all these labs generate their own cortisol values, but what that is going to have to mean is that the interpretive cutoffs that they use for their ACTH stimulation tests, the low-dose dexamethasone suppression tests, really should all be a little bit different, and I'm not convinced that they are. The LC-MS/MS lab does use different cutoff values to the Immunoassay lab, so they have taken that into account. But again, quite a range. 20 if we consider the LC-MS lab and another lab using an ELISA method, all the way up to 200 or so from the same sample sent to these 81 different labs. So has that scheme that's been running for quite a few years now been able to achieve anything? Well, when we first started, the variation between labs was over 25%, and then over time we've been able to see a reduction in that. Labs seem to be becoming more consistent generating results that are more similar to one another, and so coefficients of variation were running at below 15% for quite a while. And then in that last release, really, I think because of the confusion created by that new Immulite batch of antibody, where some labs were adapting, some were just using it without adaptation, we ended up with a much wider range of cortisol values from the one sample again. So it's a good story. The scheme has improved things. And then I think we've got a new starting point, and we'll need to work on bringing this closer together again so that people know that no matter what lab they send their results to around the world that are in the scheme, they'll get similar results. So what impact does all this have on how we interpret our results? And I've mentioned before that often we interpret cortisol results based on some diagnostic threshold or diagnostic cutoff value that we find in textbooks, or we find it in journal articles. And I think it's true to say that the kind of 8-hour cutoff values for low-dose dexamethasone suppression test, or the post-ACTH stimulation test cutoff values, those are from generally, not changed much, generally kind of from the 1990s, or at least from a time when most of that clinical endocrinology work was being done by radioimmunoassay. And what the literature is missing is any sense of what the connection is between 40 nanomoles per litre on an old radioimmunoassay used in an American university versus what 40 nanomoles per litre is on a commercial chemiluminescent analyzer used in large commercial veterinary laboratories in the 2020s. So it's hard to know. And without redoing all the clinical studies to decide what that new cutoff value should be using the technologies that are people actually using now, I think we are a bit stuck. Some of the recent reports on using baseline cortisol to screen for hypoadrenocorticism, those have often used technology like Immulite, so the values that are generated there are maybe more likely to represent values that are coming out of labs, as was the pre-vetral cortisol. Some recent work that suggested a different way to measure or monitor trilostane therapy. Again, relatively recent from a lab or a group of labs that were generally using Immulite analyzers. So I think for veterinary endocrinology, our challenge is to figure out which methods are generating the correct results, and then try and harmonize all the other methods being used in the world to those correct results, and then kind of figure out whether or not the cutoff values that we've been using for many years still apply with the results that are being generated now in the 2020s rather than those were being generated in the 1990s. So that might require new clinical studies where animals that are well characterized with their hyperadrenocorticism are separated from those that are unwell but don't have hyperadrenocorticism by new cutoff values. So this is a little bit disheartening because it's kind of saying that because of the difference in the analytical methodologies that are currently available, it's difficult to be confident that we are using the cutoff values correctly. There's also an implication for kind of how we interpret an individual test result. So if, for example, our low-dose dexamethasone suppression test cutoff value is 40, and we got a result for our patient of 42, does that mean it definitely has hyperadrenocorticism, or it's definitely a positive test result? Are we more confident if it's 50? Are we more confident if it's 60? If it had a result of 38, would we be happy to rule out hyperadrenocorticism? All of these questions relate to imprecision in the assay. And from some of the work that's available, get the impression that our coefficient of variation, at least between labs, even not within a lab, could be as high as 20%. And so if we were using a textbook cutoff value or a journal article cutoff value, for example, 138 as a journal article cutoff value, then if that's got a 20% coefficient of variation in the method that we're using, then that means we've kind of got a grey zone that's anywhere between 83 and 192. So if we were going to do something different with our patient because its cortisol was more than 138, then actually to be really sure that it's definitely more than 138, we can't be sure that it is until it's as much as 192 using assays that have got CVs as high as 20%. So trying to understand that impact on interpretation, it's sometimes helpful. This little calculator that I've used here is available from a BSAVA website. And so if we do know what the precision is in the lab we're using, the method we're using, at the concentration cutoff values that we're using, we can plug that into the spreadsheet and it'll tell us what our grey zone is. If we're trying to separate two very distinctive populations, then having a wide grey zone might not matter. But for most of the things we use cortisol to separate, we've got a bit of an overlap. And so there, having a much narrower grey zone would be better. And we get a narrower grey zone by having analytical methodologies that are more precise, that is more repeatable. So I'm finally, in one last slide almost, getting to the original question of the presentation, which is what test are we going to use when? Well, the overriding thing that's going to help us with that decision is understanding the quality of our results. What do I mean by the quality of our results? I mean, what's the error in the results that our lab is generating? That is a statistic that the labs should be able to figure out because it's a combination of imprecision and inaccuracy. That is, how variable are the results that are generated from the same sample and how far away are those results from the true result. So bias can often be created from an external quality assessment scheme, for example. A lab can find out how far its results are away from everybody else's or from the LC-MS gold standard. They can work out what imprecision their analyzer's giving and create total error. And then once we've got that concept of total error, we can recognize that actually, if we've got low concentration thresholds where there's not that much difference analytically between a 30 or a 40 or a 50, so things like basal cortisol for hypoadrenocorticism or our low-dose dexamethasone suppression test interpretation values, then we probably want that to be to have as low total error as possible. We want those results not to have very much error in them because we're going to be making decisions about that patient based on quite small differences above and below these cutoff values. Similarly, we would be making significant management decisions in trilostane therapy if we used a pre-Veterinary cortisol approach. It uses cutoffs of 40 and 138. And again, if we're going to change what therapy the animal is going to get based on that result, we probably want to be quite sure whether it falls above or below that cutoff value. However, if we're only interested in very broad categorization of results, so for example, using post-ACTH results to monitor trilostane therapy, all we're really interested in there is there general evidence of oversuppression? Is there evidence that the cortisol production is a little bit less? Is that than the reference interval for a post-ACTH sample? Or is it somewhere in that range of what a normal dog would do post-ACTH? Or is it way above what a normal dog would do? So very broad categories of response. In that case, maybe an assay that got a little less precision, or that's not as accurate or has higher total error might be acceptable. So in summary then, that's quite a long trawl, but I thought it's a very hard, difficult question to answer which test to use if I don't first cover how the tests work. So in summary, cortisol analyses do depend on immunoassays. Different antibodies in those assays would have different affinity profiles, which means different manufacturers. Cortisol results are going to be different. Immunoassays are inherently imprecise, so less than 10% imprecision is good for an immunoassay. The detection method will affect our limit of detection, how low a cortisol concentration we can measure. RIAs are adaptable, the other methods generally aren't. LCM-SMS might hold a future, might be more commonly applied in veterinary cortisol analysis, but it's not there yet. We do see results varying between labs that are using the same methods, as well as the variation that we saw between methods. And it's important that if you're using cortisol to make clinical decisions, you understand your provider's imprecision and accuracy data on their cortisol assay. We need to understand the impact of that analytical quality, that total error on the confidence in our interpretation. What's the grey zone around those cutoff values? Where's the point at which I can be really confident in my result, and where if I just ran that sample again, would I get a different result on the other side of the diagnostic threshold and make a different clinical decision? Generally, I think it's worth aiming for the low total error methods, whichever methods your manufacturers or lab providers can tell you are the lowest total error methods, then that would be the best to use. But if you're only looking for very broad categories of results, like in post-ACTH trial stain monitoring, you might get away with lower error methodologies. So thank you for your patience in listening to me through this presentation. Thank you again.